We are studying Deuteronomy chapter 5, and in that chapter, Moses is re-giving the law. And the wording is slightly different, but it's very, very close to the same. And we got to the point of the fourth commandment last week. So we'll continue with that. If you have the syllabus, we're on page 32, second column, about halfway down. So we're looking at some of the statements made by non-Adventists in regard to some of the issues about the Sabbath. And where it doesn't necessarily mean they got it all straight, but certain points they could see very clearly. And we're going to look at one now by Martin Luther. And he says on Exodus 16, verse 4, and also verses 22 to 30, he said, "Hence you can see that the Sabbath was before the law of Moses came and has existed from the beginning of the world." Now, as far as we know, Martin Luther did not keep Sabbath. He did not teach his people to keep Sabbath. Well, I've heard that he wasn't too kind to Sabbath keepers always. But on this one point, he could see that the Sabbath came all the way from creation. "Especially have the devout who have preserved the true faith, met together and called upon God on this day." And that tells you where it was translated from. A second note that he had, "The Sabbath is indispensable to man, being promotive of his highest good, physically, intellectually, socially, spiritually, and eternally." That's a pretty good perception about the value of the Sabbath, that it helps even the physical nature and the spiritual, and of course the intellectual and socially and all that. Hence its observance is connected with the best of promises and its violation with the severest penalties. And then he lists a bunch of Bible texts to prove what he just said. Its sanctity was very distinctly marked in the gathering of the manna. So, every week there was a double reminder. If you get too much manna during the week, it stinks the next morning. But on Sabbath, if you gather twice as much on Friday, it's okay on Sabbath morning. Also, if you go out on Sabbath morning to get it, there's nothing there. So he saw that point about the manna, and he had to realize the importance of the Sabbath. And then, what?
Is there any, that part, is there any symbolicism or anything that is for our day, the manna? I mean, I know the gathering, but I meant actual manna gathering on Friday, that won't spoil on Sunday.
Yeah, I don't know of any specific way to apply that. But of course, the getting of the manna is a lesson about morning worship.
Right.
Because if they went out, if they slept in, for instance, they went out, it was all gone. Once the sun came up, it was gone. So they had to gather it early. But that lesson wouldn't hold for having twice as big a worship on Friday and not getting one on Sabbath. Yeah. Anybody else thought of one? Yes.
Well, it's also an opportunity to teach the importance of preparation, having a portion of food ready.
That's true.
So you don't have to cook and prepare it.
That's true. Yeah. So that lesson does still apply. And, I find that Seventh-day Adventists in general are getting very weak on this. The preparing of the food on Friday. Some of our modern conveniences make them think, oh, it doesn't matter. You don't have to do anything. You stick it in the oven, you put the timer on, and you don't really have to do anything. Or you stick it in a microwave, so on. But the Bible still says, boil what you're going to boil before Sabbath and bake what you're going to bake before Sabbath. It still says the same thing. So I still believe we should be doing it. We tend to get lax. I've even heard ministers stand up front and say, it doesn't apply anymore. We don't have to do that anymore. I can't agree with that. I like to stick with what God said. And Spirit Prophecy says the same thing. So we got it from both directions. One other here. As presented to us in the Scriptures, the Sabbath was not the invention of any religious founder. So we can't say Moses set up the Sabbath, or even Abraham, or even Adam. We can't. That's what Martin Luther realized. It was not at first part of any system of religion, but an entirely independent institution. Very interesting. So before there was any church, the Sabbath was given. And that's true. The leader of the church, first church, was Adam. And each patriarch after that, they were the leader of the church. But it was a family. It wasn't really called a church. So the Sabbath was given in the beginning. Very definitely, it is presented in Genesis as the very first institution inaugurated by the Creator Himself. Well, we know that there was marriage also. And Adam and Eve got married before the Sabbath. So it was the second institution, but it was the two institutions that came from the Garden of Eden into our world. It was purely religious, wholly moral, wholly spiritual. It required no priest, no liturgy. It was for man as God's creature, steward, and friend. So those three paragraphs, different translators, but they were statements that Luther made from his study of the Bible and facing these questions. So, and if you don't have a book, all of these are in Bible Readings for the Home. They have a lot more than what I put in here, but I just put a few to help people who would read my syllabus to realize that it's not just Seventh-day Adventists that recognize the Sabbath. In looking now at the manna issue, Exodus 16, verse 23. And he said unto them, this is that which the Lord hath said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and boil that ye will boil, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. So very clear instruction. Do your boiling, do your baking on Friday, because tomorrow is the Sabbath. Also, of course, Ellen White says we don't have to eat cold food, that it can be warmed up on the Sabbath. But the boiling and baking is to be done ahead of time. In Exodus 20, verse 8, we'll just read the one phrase because it's slightly different here in chapter 5. But it says, remember the Sabbath day. One of the reasons he said remember is because they had been forgetting it. the majority of people, by the time Moses came back, the majority of the people were not keeping Sabbath. And so we studied last time how Moses told them, if you want God to deliver you, you need to start keeping the Sabbath again. But Pharaoh got angry with that and tried to force them to work on Sabbath. I don't know whether some did, work on Sabbath because of the pressure. But then, when they got out of Egypt, Moses gave this very straight instruction about the manna. And so, God was getting them back on track. Yes.
Could we say that remember is also a prophetic remember for these last days?
Yes.
Through history, when the Sabbath is totally forgotten.
Absolutely. It looks both ways. And in fact, with the beginning of the Millerite movement, this was the leading out of Egypt to the heavenly Canaan. And so just like the children of Israel were to begin keeping the Sabbath faithfully, so God introduced the Sabbath to Seventh-day Adventists because we were to keep it faithfully and teach the world about the Sabbath so that, we can go to the heavenly Canaan. So there's a parallel there. Then we could look at a lot of verses, but let's just look at a couple more. Exodus 31, verses 13 through 17. Exodus 31, 13 to 17. Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. I looked up that word sign to see what was the actual meaning of that word. And I'm not a Greek and Hebrew scholar, so, I have to do it the same way you can do it. And that is, I look it up in Strong's Concordance, and I look at all the definitions that they have in there of that Hebrew word. And the thing that I found very interesting was, it says sign, but it means like a flag. Okay, the United States flag is a sign. When you see that flag, that is an American, or that is a territory that's owned by Americans. It's our country, or even if it's at an embassy in a foreign country, that's the American embassy. And so the flag is something very precious to us because it's a sign of our country. Now, we belong to the heavenly home. And the flag that God has put in our hands to show to the world is the Sabbath. So whenever you're going to church, or the church doors are open on Sabbath, or you have to ask not to work on Sabbath, anything to do with the Sabbath is a sign by God to the world, these are my people. These people belong to the God of heaven. So he wanted it that way, all the way through to the end. In verse 16 it says, Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual covenant. So the Sabbath was to keep on going to the very end. We read later on in the Bible where they weren't faithful in keeping the Sabbath either all the time. But there were always some, that kept the Sabbath. There's a line of Sabbath keepers from Eden until Eden restored. There will be a line of Sabbath keepers. Sometimes the numbers get small, but we probably have the most Sabbath keepers right now that's ever been. And this is fulfilling this. Again, in verse 17, it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Why? For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Again, a quote from the fourth commandment and a quote from the very first statement about the Sabbath in Genesis 2. So, this alone should be enough to help us. Also in Exodus 35, verse 2, Exodus 35, verse 2, we get a picture of how serious this is. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you an holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whosoever doeth work therein shall be put to death. That seems really harsh to people today. Put to death for breaking the Sabbath? But, one of the things that I began to see in the Old Testament, because God always has very serious consequences. Very serious. And a lot of people think, well, that's not fair. That's too harsh. But God gave strong penalties because then people obey. If you give a light penalty, no, they might obey, but they might not because they don't mind paying whatever price it is for disobedience. Yes?
So why don't we do that today?
Well, the church hasn't been given that authority. When in the Old Testament it was what we call a theocracy. But in the New Testament, the government was given the last 6 commandments to rule, and the church the first 4. But we don't have the church doesn't have the death penalty under our jurisdiction. Now, we should labor with people and ultimately disfellowship them for not keeping the Sabbath. There is some discipline that should be considered. Yes.
Also with theocracy, it was like it would be taken to God.
Well, if it was specified, they didn't have to take it to God. But if he didn't speak about it, then they would go to the sanctuary and they would ask, and they had a Urim and Thummim that would say yes or no. Yeah. And sometimes God even spoke, told him what to do. So, breaking the Sabbath is a serious matter. And I think that more and more he is causing us to really elevate the Sabbath in our mind and to be more careful about how we keep the Sabbath. And I'm glad you're willing to come to a Vespers even when it's not quite Sabbath yet. But, to me it's a wonderful way to start the Sabbath, to have a Vesper program, and even if it stretches the Sabbath a little more, it gets our mind in the right direction, and then we go through the Sabbath, and it's a blessing. In Patriarchs and Prophets 3:07, it says, "The Sabbath is not introduced as a new institution, but as having been founded at creation." We can't use this with non-Adventists, but it can solidify our understanding that God revealed through Ellen White, that's the fact. It is to be remembered and observed as the memorial of the Creator's work. So one of the purposes of the Sabbath is to be reminded that He created us and He created the whole world. He has created so many things for us to enjoy. Isn't springtime wonderful? You just have a whole new appreciation of the things that God has created. The grass looks so green and the leaves look so nice. All of these things. Sabbath is the day to remember the Creator. Oh, and one other point on that. In order for us to do what is right, He has to create a desire to do it. And it takes just as much power for Him to do that as to say, let there be trees, or, let there be animals. That's the kind, but He's the Creator God, so He is able to make something out of nothing. And that is also a lesson that we are to contemplate on Sabbath, and to request more creative work, so that the things we used to do and enjoy doing, we don't like to do those anymore, and we want to obey. That remembering creation is to remember that as well. Pointing to God as the maker of the heavens and earth, it distinguishes the true God from all false gods. The Hindus don't have a God that can do that. The Muslims don't have a God that can do that. Nobody. Only true Christians have a God that can create from nothing. All who keep the seventh day signify by this act that they are worshipers of Jehovah. Of course, when somebody doesn't know and they're sincere, God accepts them as His child. But if they learn about the Sabbath and they're not willing to do it, it's a different story. That's how important the Sabbath is. That once we know about it, we are to keep it. Thus, the Sabbath is a sign of man's allegiance to God, as long as there are any upon the earth to serve Him. Same thing as Exodus 31 said. It's a sign all the way to the end. The fourth commandment is the only one of all the 10 in which are found both the name and the title of the lawgiver. It is the only one that shows by whose authority the law is given. So, the fourth commandment is the most important one, and today people are looking at it as the least important. It doesn't matter really what day you keep, just as long as you keep a day. Thus, it contains the seal of God, affixed to His law as evidence of its authenticity and binding force. So this commandment is the key. And I've been told, I haven't done it myself, but if you count the words of the commandment, starting at the beginning and going clear to the end, that the Sabbath commandment is right in the middle of the 10 commandments. It's the heart of the 10 commandments. So, God is especially asking, not only for Seventh-day Adventists to keep the Sabbath and preach about the Sabbath, but to be more and more careful about how we keep it. And we see something of this in Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. Isaiah 58, 13 and 14. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath. In other words, he's writing as though people have their foot on the Sabbath. And he's making a call. Take your foot off of the Sabbath. And then he's telling some ways that we take our foot off. From doing thy pleasure on my holy day. Now, of course, if we find pleasure in Bible study and going to church and so on, he's not talking about that. He's talking about the pleasures that are okay during the week. but not okay on Sabbath. And call the Sabbath a delight. So it's not just a matter of keeping the Sabbath, but it's a matter of really enjoying the Sabbath to where we call it a delight. And we can't wait for the Sabbath to come again because it's such a blessing, such a wonderful day. Call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor him, not doing thine own ways. Now this time, he breaks it down into 3 points. Not doing thine own ways. This would have to do with our, regular work. And I don't know that I want to define things too closely, but I believe that there are Seventh-day Adventists excusing their labor on Sabbath when they really shouldn't be excusing it. Because there is another way where they wouldn't have to work on Sabbath. But other people are doing it, so they think it's okay to do it. I've even heard of some saying, well, I'm a policeman. And, policemen, there has to be policemen on duty every day of the week, so it's not wrong for me to be doing my duty on Sabbath. Or somebody works in a prison, and they have to have someone guarding the prisoners every day of the week. And so they rationalize that it's okay for me to work on Sabbath. But I don't believe that's true. I think unless, and probably the one that is done the most is nurses. Now, if it's an Adventist hospital, yes, we have to work on Sabbath because we're the ones that run the hospital. But if we work in a non-Adventist hospital, there's plenty of people that can work on Sabbath. We don't have to work on Sabbath. We can get that day off. And I think we really need to take a serious look at the rationalizations that we're doing as a church about Sabbath keeping. Yes.
We have a lot of Adventist hospitals, and when the nurse requests for a Sabbath off, usually they do it like every other Sabbath, because the others also like to have a weekend off.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a lot of options. And doctors too, they work in the non-Adventist hospital.
Yeah, well, doctor's a little different situation. If the doctor is running his own practice and he has an emergency on the Sabbath, if it's his patient, I don't think that's a problem because he is responsible for that patient. He can't say, well, let some other doctor see you today because I don't want to see you today. But I've noticed that doctors have changed a lot the way they do things. You can't see your doctor except by appointment anymore. They send you to the emergency room and you see the emergency room doctor and then maybe the hospitalist. So that opens a door for even Seventh-day Adventist physicians to be off on Sabbath. Not just nurses, but even Seventh-day Adventist doctors. We don't, call up the doctor and say, I got a problem, can you see me today? We don't do that anymore. It used to be when I was young, you could call up your doctor any day of the week and you could even come to your house and see you and take care of you. But I don't think it's any harder for a nurse to get Sabbath off than for somebody that goes to Walmart to work or somebody that, goes to any company that works on Sabbath. And as soon as you tell them that you want Sabbath off, you're in danger of losing your job. Well, why should nurses be exempt? I don't see any reason. But, you have to make your own decision. I'm just telling you that I am very concerned about the laxity on Sabbath keeping. If we can't stand up for the Sabbath now, what are we going to do when it's the death penalty? How are we going to have the courage to stand up for Sabbath keeping then? I don't think we will. We have to be willing to even be without a job now, so that when the time comes it's a death penalty, we will, stand up for it. Yes. Yes. Well, I had a small experience with that. I was in the Army, and they sent me to Vietnam. So I knew that Sabbath might be an issue, and I went to my first sergeant, and I told him, explained that I was Seventh-day Adventist and that I couldn't work on Sabbath. He said, if your duty comes up on Sabbath, you'll have to do it. Now, in the Army, if you disobey an order, you go to jail, or you could, in combat zone, you could even be killed for this. So I didn't know, I thought, oh boy, I don't know what I'm going to face here, but I wasn't going to work on Sabbath. I knew that. Well, for about 8 or 9 months, no duty was asked of me on Sabbath. I was a medic, so I went to the aid station and I told the doctor the same thing. And the doctor said, don't worry. Said, you can have Sabbath off. So the Lord opened that door for me. And down the road a little ways, some of the other workers were complaining. Atwood gets Sabbath off, and we work 7 days a week, and he gets Sabbath off. And I heard the first sergeant tell the ones that were complaining, listen, you be quiet. He does more work in 6 days than you do in 7. And so, I went almost to the end of my time in the Army, and it never came up about having a duty. But then they put me on KP on Sabbath. And I thought, I wonder what I can do now. So I talked to one of the other soldiers and swapped with him. And I don't remember how many times it came up, 2 or 3 times, but the Lord always helped me to find somebody to swap with me so that I could have it off. So I never got in trouble over it. But I believe that when you make a decision, I'm going to keep the Sabbath, that the Lord opens the door for you to do it. Okay, the second one that it says is reminding us again, nor finding thine own pleasure. So there are maybe some recreational things that would be okay to do during the week, but not on Sabbath. There might be, a variety of things. Gardening is one that I find pleasurable, but I don't do it on Sabbath. So those kind of things we leave aside for the Sabbath. And the hardest one of all for us, I believe, is the third one. Nor speaking thine own words. Have you ever caught yourself talking about something that's not Sabbath talk? Or somebody is visiting with you and they bring up a subject that's not Sabbath talk, and before we know it, we're talking about things that don't belong on the Sabbath. So we have to learn to recognize that and to try to avoid that, because it's just as if we're actually doing those things on Sabbath. If we're talking about them, it's like we're doing them. And there are some Adventists I don't really like to be around on Sabbath because it seems like they can't enjoy talking about spiritual things. And so maybe for a minute or two, they're talking about it, but pretty soon they're talking about something else that's not Sabbath talk. And so, you don't want to keep reminding them or keep trying to change the conversation. It's too hard. So I don't do a lot of visiting on Sabbath, to be honest, because that's such a big problem. But really, the way we should be thinking is, wow, we get a whole day to think spiritual thoughts and to talk on spiritual subjects and to read. If we can't think of anything, to read something and talk about it. Plus, spending time in nature, enjoying the creation of God and all that. There's so many things we can do on the Sabbath that we don't need those other three things that we went through. So this is a special call. These verses are a special call for our day. Since the Adventist Church started in 1844, until we meet Jesus in the clouds of heaven, this text is our job. We are to inform people about the Sabbath, and we are to elevate the Sabbath higher and higher to where people's habits are in perfect harmony with how the Sabbath should be kept. Now, he tells what the result will be in verse 14. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. So those who keep the Sabbath fully receive amazing blessings that I don't think any of us have fully tasted yet. And I've tried to study a little bit. What do these phrases mean? I mean, the first one is easy. He says, I will cause you to ride on the high places of earth. But the one that says, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, I'm not fully sure what that means, but it wasn't just Abraham that they looked back to. They looked back to Jacob as well. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are three names that get used a lot. So there is a call. And the closer we get to the end, there is a greater call to keep the Sabbath fully and learn to get the blessings that he wants to give us. One more, and we'll have to close with that for tonight. Patriarchs and Prophets 3:07. God has given me 6 days wherein to labor, and he requires that their own work be done in the 6 working days. So if we don't get it done, it waits a day. We get it all done within the 6 days. However, acts of necessity. So you have a dairy, and the cows can't be left without being milked on Sabbath. That would be torturing the animal. So it's an act of necessity. We can't hire somebody to do it, because if we hire somebody, it's the same as if we did it. So, it's not wrong for us to do it on Sabbath. Acts of necessity and mercy. So somebody's in pain. A doctor, again, the doctor's situation has totally changed today, but, if it was like it used to be and someone is in pain and they call up their doctor, it's not wrong for him to minister to their pain on Sabbath. Acts of mercy are permitted on the Sabbath. The sick and suffering are at all times to be cared for, But we need to understand that's talking about Seventh-day Adventist hospitals, that we are to care for the sick.
Pastor,
Yes.
I don't buy that idea.
Well, that's okay.
There is a bias there.
Uh,
Here in Tennessee, we don't have an Adventist hospital. Why is it that it's only caring only for patients in an Adventist hospital? There are lots of patients in many hospitals.
Yeah.
I don't think we should choose to care only for those in the Adventist hospitals.
Well, I'll just give you one reason, but my purpose tonight is just to stir your thinking, not to tell you what you have to do. But when you read about Adventist sanitariums, really, we were to have not just hospitals, but sanitariums in hospitals. And in those facilities, we were to change the duties on Sabbath, so that a lot of the things that a hospital downtown does would not be done in an Adventist hospital. Because we are to shape everything to have a Sabbath atmosphere in our facilities. That's what we do there at Wildwood. Everything is changed on Sabbath. So it's not as harmful for a nurse to work on Sabbath in our facility. But when she has to work in a non-Adventist facility, they expect you to do everything that's done on the other days of the week. They don't change it at all. And so that's just, when you study widely about this matter, that's some of the things that you get.
But Loma Linda doesn't do that, Pastor.
Oh, I know.
Yeah,
Doesn't mean they're right.
same as other hospitals.
It doesn't mean they're right, though, just because they don't do it.
Which was about that.
Right. Yes.
Many times the nurses will donate their pay, even if there's pay or come and work as volunteers on Sabbath in an Adventist hospital that's run correctly, rather than be reimbursed for regular paid work.
Yes. My aunt did that. She worked out in Adventist hospitals, but I still have to, I worked for 10 years in Adventist hospitals, so I know what goes on. And they haven't gotten better since I used to work so many years ago. And there's a lot of unnecessary work that's done on Sabbath in Adventist hospitals. And this is not pleasing to the Lord. But anyway, I'm just here to stir your thinking. Okay, then it's quoted after what we just read here. It says, but unnecessary labor is to be strictly avoided. So there's necessary work for the care of the sick, and there's unnecessary work. And we need to judge carefully and leave the unnecessary work for later, or do it ahead of time. And then it quotes, turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and honor him, not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure. Nor does the prohibition end here, nor speaking thine own words, says the prophet. Those who discuss business matters or lay plans on the Sabbath are regarded by God as though engaged in the actual transaction of business. At Wildwood we had a mechanic, and he told me one time, he said, Pastor Atwood, you're the only one that doesn't ask me about car problems on Sabbath. I thought, what? I'm the only one? Everybody else asked him about. No, I had lots of cars that were always breaking down. Now the ones I have right now don't, but I just felt it's not right to talk to the mechanic about what's wrong with your car on Sabbath. You find a way to take care of it, unless you're stranded out on the highway or something. But apparently people don't mind bringing up and discussing with the mechanic about their cars. So it says, those who discuss business matters or lay plans on the Sabbath are regarded by God as though engaged in the actual transaction of business. To keep the Sabbath holy, we should not even allow our minds to dwell upon things of a worldly character. And the commandment includes all within our gates. The inmates of the house are to lay aside their worldly business during the sacred hours. All should unite to honor God by willing service upon His holy day. Now that's a pretty strict statement, but I believe that we will be blessed if we follow it. Yes?
Is it lawful to do good on Sabbath?
If it's necessary, yes. Now, Adventists are more and more putting on roofs on Sabbath and doing all kinds of things. To be honest, I don't think that's necessary to do on Sabbath.
Is it better to be idle than to do nothing?
Oh no, Sabbath should be a busy day. Sabbath should be a busy day, but not with the same things of the week. Well, maybe I've stirred your mind a little bit. Okay? I'm not going to watch you and see what you're doing or whatever. You have to answer to God, not to me.